Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to be making a Ruby on Rails web application that allows a user to upload a photo to the server, then run that photo through a pre-trained TensorFlow Keras model. Specifically for this, what I've done is I've trained a TensorFlow Keras model to classify one of 4 different diseases based on the Plant Village dataset. The Plant Village dataset is a combination of a bunch of images of different plants with different diseases. I chose to classify with narrowing the criteria for just apple leaves and 4 different diseases. This was healthy, rot, rust, and scab. So let me show you what the final product's going to look like. So if I go to my local browser, and I go to localhost 3000, you're going to see this nice little web application. Nothing too fancy, no real graphics put in this, but this is something that you could do as you develop your own. So what it allows me to do is actually submit a new job. I called these inference runs jobs. So I'm going to name it, let's do rot, because I know I'm going to want to detect a test image from the rot classification file. If I choose file, here you can see the Plant Village data set I've split out. I've got the testing set, and I'm in the raw classification section. So I like this guy. Obviously it's named test demo rot because I've been using it. So what's going to happen here is this image is going to get fed through the machine learning model, and it's going to decide which of 4 classifications it finds the most likely, and then output that classification back to the user on the web page. So if I go ahead and open, it's going to upload it up, and I hit create. Should push it to the server. Look at that. It said it was just fine. So go back, and now I've got this queued up job. So no inference is actually ran yet. So this lets me run a bunch more jobs, queue them all up if I'd like to, and run them at a later date. But once I hit run inference, it's actually going to spin up the Keras model, and you're going to see that I got the classification of black rot. Not too shabby. So let's jump into the code and let me show you how to do this. So to get started, there are a few prerequisites you have to have. Now I'm making the assumption that whatever your dev machine is can run TensorFlow. This would either be TensorFlow CPU or TensorFlow GPU. Either way, whatever it wants to run, as long as it can run and import TensorFlow, you should be fine. Now I realize that can be a fairly complicated process, so I'm thinking I'll make a new video about that, how to install it, how to set it up specifically for Ubuntu and Linux in the future. But right now, to make sure that if you have it, what you want to make sure you can do is open Python 3, and then just do import, if I can spell, TensorFlow TF. If this works, and you get the little prompt again asking for input, then you know it went through and everything's fine. So that's the first step. So the next thing you're going to want to make sure you have is Ruby. Ruby is the programming language that Rails is built around. Now, often Ruby and Rails are confused to be the same thing. That's not true. Ruby is the language and Rails is the framework built around Ruby that allows for really, really fast web app development. I absolutely love it. So a lot of you may already have Ruby installed, or you may not know if you do. The easiest way is just to run a simple ruby-v if you're on Linux, and this shows that I have version 2.7.2 installed. Now, what if I didn't? I'm going to walk through the installation steps for Ruby, and I'll also link them in the description below. So the first step is to get some of the prereqs done, get curl and some of the libraries. So I'll fast forward through this part, and for you, if this is your first time and you're missing some of these, it may take a little while to install them. If you've done some other development in the past that uses the same things, they might skip right through. Let's get started. So the important thing to note here is that we're actually using RVM. RVM is Ruby's version management system, and basically it allows your system to install multiple Ruby versions and track them and select easily which one you want to use. So we just installed RVM, and now we want to add it to the source. Let's run this guy. Okay. And now what I'm going to do here is I'm actually going to tell RVM to install Ruby 2.7.2. I'm using 2.7.2 just because it's the one I'm familiar with, and I've used it for a little bit now. If you decide that you want to go to a newer version, if there's a newer one by the time that you like, or an older version, that's fine. Just make sure you understand the limitations of Ruby of that version and are aware that you may need to adapt some of the code in this tutorial for that. So let's go ahead and tell RVM that we want the default to be 2.7.2 in case we've got different versions installed. And now let's go ahead and rerun our Ruby check. So obviously for me, I already had it, so this isn't groundbreaking or anything like that, but for you, this should be where you actually get your output of the version that you just installed. So now let's install Rails. Ruby uses the system called gems to install basically packages like you would have in Python. Rails is actually one of those. So the first thing we need to do is be able to install those gems. So in Python, where you have to install pip, we also need to install a system called bundler that allows us to install gems for Ruby. So the first command is going to be gem install bundler. Jeepers if I can spell. There we go. Installed one gem after about 3 seconds. So now what we want to do is we actually want to install Rails. And specifically what I'm going to do here is I'm going to copy and paste this command. Again, all these commands will be in the description below. But I'm going to actually install version 6.0.3.4. Now, again, that's specifically because of the version that I've tested this tutorial with from when I did it the first time. And I know that it's something that's going to be stable and it's going to work. For you, if you decide you want to use a different version of Rails, absolutely should be fine. Just make sure you understand any changes or limitations that may occur with it so that you can adjust the code as you see fit. So this may take a little bit on your system, depending on if it's the first time you've ever done it or not. But just sit back, get some coffee, and we'll start back up when this finishes. We're back, not too long, pretty awesome. So now we should be ready, fingers crossed, to run our very first Ruby on Rails web application. So the first thing I want to do is I want to make a directory to keep this all separate. Wow, I can't type. So if I go into that guy, so now I'm here, I'm ready to start making a Ruby on Rails web application. Now making a web application with Rails is so simple, it's ridiculous. So it's literally a one-line command to get things pre-installed and a lot of auto-generated code for you. So what we're actually going to do here is do Rails, and then specifically this is unnecessary if you want to use the default version, but I'm going to tell you exactly what version of Rails, the 6.03 that we just installed. Oops. And I am looking at my other monitor to make sure I've got it all written down. Underscore. And then I'm going to tell the keyword new. New is going to make a new Ruby on Rails web application, and then I'm going to give it the name. So the name is really going to be the directory, the name of the directory that all your code is going to be put into. And it's got a very specific hierarchy and very specific organization that all Rails applications follow. So for me, I'm going to call this the, let's call it the Keras app. And you see here, it's going to be creating a bunch of new files for you. It's going to be downloading certain things. It's really getting your system very well set up for what you're about to do here. Awesome, we back. So that may take quite a while depending on your machine. But once you're here, we're actually ready to go ahead and run our very first Ruby on Rails application. So if you ls, you're going to see that a folder got made with the application's name. So if you go into that, what you're going to see here is a whole bunch of directories and files that Ruby on Rails automatically built and set up for us. We're going to go into a few of these in a bit here, but what I first want to do is run Rails S. Now Rails S is actually going to launch our server for us. So if I go ahead and hit this, as long as everything was done properly, we should be able to see, awesome, look at that. It's a development environment, and it's hosting on localhost port 3000. So I go to the Chrome browser again, I go localhost 3000, boom, very first Ruby on Rails application. Congratulations, that's awesome. All right, now let's do something actually productive with it. If I go ahead and stop this, first thing we're going to want to do is we're going to want to build a form. And a form can be built in a lot of different ways. I'll go into more detail in probably a different video, but for now, I'm just going to send the commands out, do a little bit of description about them, and then if you want more detail, I'll definitely recommend looking at either the video I make in the future or some other great YouTube videos out there for Rails applications. It's amazing the things you can find out there. Alright, so first thing we're going to do is actually run Rails G for shortcut for generate. Rails has this awesome ability to generate as a keyword multiple different things that you would need in a typical web application. So for us specifically, we're going to do a scaffold, which is kind of a about as big as it gets of a self-help for you. Wow, if I could type. of auto this. So scaffold's going to auto generate a whole lot of stuff for you. It's probably going to be a little overkill for certain things you're going to want to do, but for us it's perfect right now. We're just trying to go as fast as possible. I want to make a job. Now a job is going to be basically the table, or if it's easier for you to think about, like the object in a database that we're going to want to be able to create, destroy, and edit. So if you think of a standard database, for those of you that are familiar with that type of stuff, your typical actions with something like a table, or specifically an entry in a table, would be create one, destroy one, edit one. That's what this is going to allow us to do, and it's going to generate the piping for all that, along with things like the HTML view, the base view, and the actual interaction, so the controller with the database. So we're going to do that, scaffold job, and I'm going to give it a single parameter. So the single parameter, this is because it's also going to set up the back end of the database for us. We need to tell it, hey, what kind of data do I want to store? Well, I want to store the ID name of type string. Just checking over here to make sure, make sure this is all good. So when I run this, it's actually going to just auto-generate a whole lot of files, and you're going to see them here in a second. Boom, look at that. So it created a bunch of files in the app views directory. It made a controller. It made a view. And really what this is going to do is allow us to have a lot of functionality out of the gate. But there's a few things we still need to do before we can actually use it and we can see it kind of in action. So the next thing we want to do is we actually want to run rake db migrate. So the way Ruby on Rails works at a very high level, not going to butcher some of the really cool parts about it, is that it'll allow it to, when it does this auto generation stuff, it will also generate migration files for the database. So Rails lets you use pretty much any database you want. It defaults to, I think, MySQL or SQLite. I think it's SQLite. But you can choose whichever one you want to use, and then eventually run these migrations on it and update the tables in that database, really without you having to do any true manual database work. But it's important to do these every time you touch the database in any kind of way, or otherwise you could be running in a mode where you think you've got something in the database, or you think you have some sort of relationship and it's not there. And Rails is pretty good about identifying that you have a migration that you haven't actually ran through and updated the database with, and it will pretty much stop you from running. So if you get that error where it says must run db migrate, now you know what this is kind of talking about. If I run this, it's going to run that migration, which for us is going to be making that new table. It says created jobs, migrated, all nice and well. So we've got one more thing before we can actually do that, and that's to readjust the route. So if I go ahead and open code here, oops. All right. So what we're going to see is here's the actual layout of our Rails application. You're pretty much going to live in two folders. You're going to live in app, and for us specifically, we're going to be living in lib. But realistically, you've got a lot of stuff going on down here too. This is your gem file. This is where you can add things like, okay, so it is SQLite. You can add different styling. You can add some JavaScript stuff. It's kind of like your pip modules for Python. It's kind of a bad way of thinking about that, but as a way you can kind of draw that analogy if it helps you. But for us specifically, we want to go to config and routes RB. So the way Ruby on Rails works is basically it keeps track of all the different places it could possibly go given a specific, all the views that you have. So HTML files, all the different buttons and clicks that you go to. The routes RB basically determines, hey, I've got access to this. This is an available destination that internally I can go to. But it also tells us what's our starting page, what's our landing page. And because we just added a whole new web page, I'm going to want to tell it that I don't want it to start off at that hello, welcome to Rails page. I want it to start off at the page we just built. So the first thing we're going to actually have to do is define root. That is the root page. And we're going to call it, should be jobs, and then it's going to be the index. If that doesn't make sense, that's okay. This isn't really a true Ruby on Rails tutorial. I'll go more in depth in that in a different tutorial, but let me explain it just a little bit. So jobs was obviously kind of our whole overarching object that we built. Jobs was this combination of the database integration, the HTML view, and then the middle line controller that lets you interact between those two, the HTML front end page and the database backend. And we want to tell Ruby when it launch or Ruby on Rails when it launches up our web application, we want to go to the index page that was created for us, referencing that relates to jobs, the object. So the easiest way, like, how do you see all these? How do you know which ones you have? What's going on here? If you go to app, you're going to have 3 real folders that are going to be critical for you. You're going to have controllers, which I'll talk about in a bit, models, which is right here, and then specifically views. Now, if you notice with all of those, if I open them all up, they all have jobs. When you first start your Rails application, you're only going to have application controller and application reference record. But for us, because we built a scaffold with job, it's going to have the namespace job controller, and then namespace model and namespace view. So if I specifically go to view and I go to jobs, this was all auto-generated for us. We've got an index html.erb, so embedded Ruby is what allows Ruby to work well with HTML. And we're going to see this little page here. We're going to say jobs with a name and a very simple little form. It's going to have the edit page option, the new page option, the show page option, and a form, basically a sub little piece of HTML that can get called from any of the other index or HTMLs. But what we want to do here is we want to make sure the root is jobs index HTML. So if you notice the naming there, so jobs index HTML. If I go to routes, I've got jobs with the hash, which is the standard syntax to break that up, the index. And you don't need to put the HTML ERB, it's going to know what to do there. If I go ahead and save that, and I go ahead and run my server again, this time when I go to localhost and refresh, once it takes a sec, look at that, jobs, new job. How crazy simple is that? So let's take a look at some of the functionality here. I get a new job and I can create a name and create the job. That's it. I can go back, I can delete it, I can edit it. I can't actually upload photos to that. Photos to it actually requires a little bit of tweaking and a different system to allow a user to upload something like that. Alright, so we're back at the code, and what we're going to want to do here is we're going to actually want to use a gem called active storage to allow us to store images on a Ruby on Rails application. Active storage makes the complications of storing something like that in a database super simple. So the first thing I'm actually going to go is I'm actually going to go back to the terminal, clean this up, and I'm going to run Rails, if I can type, active storage, and then what I'm going to want to do is just run install. Now this is going to take a little bit, it's going to run through, and for me, it's already there. For you, it might actually do a little bit of stuff, but at the end of the day, it's going to make a migration file. Now we've already seen how to handle these, so what we're actually going to do is we're going to run Rails db migrate. That's going to be one of your best friends if you continue to do Ruby on Rails development. Once we run this, our database should be updated, and we should be allowed to store, basically, active storage is these kind of like object things that allows us to attach an image to our database. So the next thing we want to do is we actually want to tell the controller or the model in our Ruby on Rails application that we're going to be expecting an image. So Ruby on Rails uses an MVC model. So this is model view controller. Model is basically, if you think about model as the code attachment point to the database, anything that you're going to do with the database pretty much directly is going to need to come from the model file. The controller is kind of the in-between between the index, the user's web page they see, and the actual model file itself, specifically with the database at the back end. And the view is obviously the embedded Ruby HTML. So if you've done web development with just classic HTML and CSS, this is where you're going to be most familiar probably. If I go ahead and close views and close the controller, I'm going to go to the model, I'm going to go to the job.rb, and what I actually want to do is I want to tell it that I'm allowing an image to be stored into the database, specifically in the table of jobs. So I'm just going to copy and paste this little file over, this one line over. And all this is saying is that it has an attached image. Nothing too crazy there, but it's super important. And now, what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to actually update the form. So the form that they gave us just has some ugliness to it, but more importantly, it doesn't allow for an image. There was no image field that I could allow my users to upload their image to. So the easiest way to do that is actually, if I close model, not to have too many things open, I'm going to close config. If I open views, I had this partial. So a partial is designated with this underscore, and so what I was saying was able to be used by multiple index or multiple HTML pages. So if we go into here, what we actually see is I've got this kind of pseudo form field here. If you're familiar with HTML, it's going to be very straightforward for you, but Ruby actually gives us a little bit of a better way of doing this. So I'm going to actually delete this. I'm going to copy and paste the embedded Ruby code that I want to throw in here. And specifically what I'm doing here is I'm using what's called Nifty Form. Nifty Form is just a really awesome included Ruby on Rails method of making a form that I personally really like. Some people don't like it. I love it. That allows me to quickly and very cleanly make a little form, along with the ability to it works really well with, like, say I want to do some CSS styling with Bootstrap. It works really well with that. I've got a different project that I've done that with, and the formatting came out very nice. So what have I done here? Well, I've made I'm told that I want to have a form that's attached to the job object, the job table database. I'm using Nifty Form, and I've just got this little designator F here. So basically what I'm saying is if the job image, so if the image is attached, so if I've made a job through the database already and I've attached an image to it, when I land on this page or I land on the show page, I want to first check, say, hey, if there's an image attached, I want to display it. I want to show it. If not, obviously there's nothing to display. I'm not going to show it. So here I'm just saying I'm going to make a 200 pixel little square block that shows the image that the user's already uploaded. I'm going to offer the ability to have a name, and I'm also going to add the image field. And then that should be pretty much all you need for that form. I go ahead and save this guy. And now the last thing we really need to do to be able to actually upload an image is I'm going to run into, And so the last thing we need to do to actually allow the user to upload an image is to edit the controller a little bit. So actually what I need to do is just allow that when the user submits the form, allow the image to be a valid data type that's passed through. Basically what happens with Ruby on Rails, specifically with how you can upload forms, is the controller is very picky about what it's going to allow the user to submit. This is to protect your database and protect security and a lot of other things, but if you're not aware of it, it can really throw you up. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go to controllers, and I'll show you what I'm talking about. So right down here at line 72 for me, there's this little line that says params require job, and it says permit name. So right now, if I were to make a new entry in the table or a new job, it would go through just fine, but it wouldn't have my image with it. It would only have the name in the database because I'm saying I'm not allowing image to go through. So all I need to do here is just do boop and go image. If I save this, make sure that I got that right, life should be all good. So now if I go ahead and rerun my application and I go back to my local host, let's take a look here. This should be pretty neat. New job, boom, choose file, and I actually have create job and create here. So I actually have a mistake. So I'm going to go back to my form HTML, and it looks like I forgot to get rid of the submit button. We don't need that because we have the submit button right here and we named it create. Let's go ahead and restart this guy. If I can type, holy cow. And let's reload. Boom, look at that. All right, that's all good now. Now if I know a name, let's do testing. Choose a file. Sure, let's choose that guy. That seems fine. Let's create. Ooh, what do we have here? Job, save, invalid signature. Where did I mess up? 1 second, let me figure this out. Okay, I found it. I'm being the biggest idiot in the world. So we actually don't need any of this. That was part of the form itself. I'm being very stupid. And all you should actually have is a little nifty form. That's all we care about. And yeah, that should do it. So now if I go back and I do restart the server, we should be cooking with fire. Job. Sure, let's choose that and create. Boom. Okay, Java's created successfully. Let's go back. And all you can really do is edit, destroy it, but you can't run the inference. We haven't added that part of it yet. But right now, what you've got is a nice little simple web app that lets you upload an image and destroy it, edit the sorry. So right now, all you can really do is you can show, edit, and destroy it. You can't really run the inference. There's nothing that allows you to do that. We haven't added that code. We haven't done any of that. You've got a little simple web app that is accessing a database and storing images. So congratulations, it's pretty cool. If you want to use that for something else, that's a pretty common thing that a lot of web applications, if you look at them, when you actually go use them, will utilize. And if you're going to do some web app development of your own, this might be something that you decide you really want to use. So let's start making the machine learning side of things. So the way I'm actually going to do this, I'm going to show you how to run a Python process on a button click in a Ruby Rails application. Now this doesn't just have to be for machine learning. If you are a pretty adept Python developer and you've got some scripts that you really like using, you've got a lot of tools, but maybe you just want to give your users or your coworkers at a company an ability to access those in a very simple way through a simple server, a web application like this would be a pretty awesome approach for that. So the first thing we want to do is actually make a new HTML embedded Ruby file. So I'm going to go to my other monitor to make sure I know what I'm writing here. Yep, okay. So if I go back to the code, I'm going to close these views. We shouldn't need to really touch them much anymore. And I'm going to close the controllers and close the model and just have the views open. So inside of the jobs folder I've got here, I actually want to allow the user to access another page. This another page is going to be what I showed you in the beginning, that after I've hit the run inference button, it's going to display out just a single one-line text that says this was a black rot leaf, or this was whatever your classification is. So if I go ahead and just do a new file, I'll call it run.html.erb. And now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to copy and paste over the code that I need, and then I will walk through it and explain it in a little bit more detail. It is super straightforward though. Boom. So crazy. So all this page does, it's simple HTML headers, says running job. It's going to give you the job ID, which was the ID that's used in a database table. So if you're familiar with databases, that's straight up just the ID. I'm giving it a classification, little tag, and I'm saying spit out the class. And this class variable we haven't done yet. I'm going to show you where that comes from in a second here. But I'm also going to allow the user the option to link back to the previous page, which for us is just going to be the display of all the jobs we currently have available to run an inference on. So that's super straightforward, nothing too crazy there. But now what we need to do is we actually want to make that variable class. And that variable class is going to come out of a function that we're going to add in that ties in with the HTML here. So everything with Rails kind of tracks itself together with its naming convention. So for index, or for basically the create button, in the controller there's a create method. Because we're doing the run HTML, I also want to have the run method in the controller. So if I go over to the controllers, or the jobs controller, here's what I mean by that. Kind of go through, look at all this. We've got the index definition, so the index function, the new, the edit, create, which is going to be utilized in the new section, along with the update for editing, and destroying for obviously destroying. So what I want to do is I'm going to actually go right here between the edit and the create. I'm going to make a new one called def run. And I'm going to copy and paste what I've got here, and then I'm going to walk through it. So right here, we're just going to go boom, def run. So I'm just making another function that I'm saying, hey, this is straight up Ruby code, and I want the system to be allowed to use it. So if I go ahead and delete those guys, those are unnecessary. It's literally just going to be about 4 lines of code. I've got the function def, and basically what I'm saying, I've got a new job object, so a new entry into the job table, and I want it to find it by the its ID. So when you make a new object, it's going to pass in all these parameters, and specifically the ones, so for us it would be ID, name, and basically image, though image, because it's going through active storage, is kind of getting its own way of getting passed over there. I'm going to say, look, I want to, for every image that's stored in that, because you could actually have multiple images in a single job. For us, we're just doing one. I want to run the script Python that I'm going to put in the libassets Python folder that I've named bounding box. I'm going to pass in an argument to that file called file.path, and file being the image itself. So basically I'm passing in the image path. And the output of that is going to be variable class. Now Ruby on Rails does this cool thing where if you have the @ symbol in front, it's a variable that it knows can get passed between the controller and the HTML. So if remember when I talked about the MVC for Ruby on Rails, basically the model is the direct access to the database. Controller is that bridge between the HTML view and that model. So by being able to pass a variable between the controller and the HTML, I can actually have the controller in conjunction with the model run a bunch of processing, access a bunch of stuff on the database, and spit out just a single nice variable back to the user through the HTML page. And that's what this class variable does. So we've got the class variable here. It's going to be the output. For us, this is going to be a print statement that I have in this Python script that's outputting the classification that it's done. And then from here, this is what we saw where it just prints it out. So that is basically as straightforward as it gets. One of the pretty much the last steps we need to do here is just add in this Python script. So I'm making the assumption that you have an inference script. I will show you mine that can run your pre-trained model. Again, I will make another video that kind of talks about a little more in depth of some of the Keras TensorFlow training stuff, because that's really cool, something I love, and a little more in detail about the Ruby on Rails stuff. So this is meant to kind of just be an overview combination of the two. If you look at the line I just wrote, it can tell you exactly where we're going to be storing this. This is kind of a standard place to store something like this. We're going to go ahead and do lib, assets. I'm going to make a new folder, call it Python. And in this folder is going to have a few things. We're going to have this boundingbox.py, the trained Keras model, along with any other supporting files that you may need that are getting called by the bounding box. So if I go ahead and just copy and paste those guys in from my other directory. Okay, so I've loaded those in, and we've got the Keras H5 model along with the detect.py. And actually, this is a typo from the other, when I was testing the tutorial. I actually just want detect.py. And if I go here, let's take a look at this guy. So it's pretty straightforward. If you guys have done anything with Keras and specifically with running an inference model through Python, this should look super familiar to you. I do some simple things with NumPy. I'm loading in the Keras, the model's specific functions, along with the pre-processing. And the meat and potatoes comes from this run inference function. I load in the image, at 500 by 500. That's just the size I did for training, so I want to make sure I got the input layer dimensions correct. Make it an array, expand the dimensions to get the input for the input layer correct. And then here, if you guys have any comments onto how to do this better, I would love to hear them. But what I'm doing here is I'm loading in the model, and unfortunately I am having to pass in the full path to the model itself. For whatever reason, I could not get that to work with just doing some system level stuff to get, and along with the OS to get the actual current working directory. It was just a little weird. So this is what I settled on. Let me actually update this though, because it is not currently accurate, or no, it actually is. It's got the correct path to the frozen Keras.h5 in the YouTube stuff, Keras app, lib, assets, Python, frozen Keras. Perfect. I then run model predict, which is a standard Keras function call. And because I know the order of the classifications that I trained on, I know that I can map the specific prediction, which just produces a 0 through the n number of classes you have. I guess it would be n minus 1 number of classes you have. And I can map them to specific strings. So I've got 0 being scab, 1 black rot, 2 healthy, 3 rust. And I know those are accurate to what's actually going to be coming out of this prediction. I then return that class name. And here's the kind of interesting part. It's not crazy or anything like that, but it's definitely good to know if you haven't really messed with this stuff before, specifically running a Python process in Ruby and passing the variable back out. Anything that you print in one of these Python scripts is something that's being considered passed back out into the Ruby side of things. So if I printed class name and then hello, and I come over to the controller, this class variable that I'm capturing that output on is actually going to be both the class name and that hello string that I did. So essentially what you need to do here is you need to limit yourself to the printout statements that you're doing, or basically the different types of returns. So I realize that I'm saying return very liberally, but it's return in the sense that anything that the script's going to output to the user either through the console or through just a general standard out. Then we go back. So if we go back to detect, and then we look at the last little thing here, we've just got the standard main entry point. I'm taking in the system argument, which is going to be to the path to the image, and the class name is getting done with the run inference and then printing the class name. So with that, if I go look over here, make sure I didn't miss anything, that should just about do it. The last thing we need to do is just update the routing, because what we did here is we added a new, in the controller, we added a new function that we are allowed to call, the run. And we want to make sure that Ruby on Rails knows that that is a viable option. And then we also need to add a little button to the HTML, the show job HTML, that lets us access this function. So first thing let's do is let's make sure that this job is something that can actually be seen by the whole Rails framework. So I'm going to go over here, I'm going to copy and paste what I've got. And I'm going to go back to config routes. Let's go controller name. What I actually want to do here is I'm just going to replace this little top section here with this guy. So it's the same stuff except for the fact that I added a couple extra functions, or a couple other do calls that I wanted to do based on all the different functions that I can do. I say for every member, get run is a viable option that you can do. This is pretty ugly. There's a lot of better ways of doing this. It was very hacky, very quick, but it does work. So now I just need to add that button, and then we have a fully functioning web application that runs machine learning inference calls. Let's go ahead and just copy this guy and go to the index.html in our views folder. Eventually you're going to start to get the hang of kind of where everything is. It does make logical sense once you actually play with it a little bit. I know it can be overwhelming at first. And all I want to do is I want to add, you can see here I've got the show, edit, and destroy. I'm going to actually delete show because I don't care about that. And then I'm going to add in this little tag there a run inference. And I'm saying link a run inference button to the run job path that's associated with the specific job. That's what I'm passing in. I'm passing in the specific job that you just made into this method. So if we save that, and let's just look a little bit one more time at the controller. Look at run. You say, okay, I passed in the variable job, getting it by parameter name from the job that I just passed in. I'm going to grab its associated image, and then I'm going to pass that image path into this Python script and output class. Then class is going to come out and display to this HTML. So with all those little layers in place, and if it's confusing to you, I encourage you to go back and rewatch sections of the video to kind of see the flow of it. Now that you've gotten to the end of it, it should make a little more sense as to which step, why we were doing which step where. But now, let's go here and restart this server. Let's see what we got going on. I'm sure it's going to blow up and not work at all, but let's see. Let's refresh. There we go. We've got run inference, the ability to run this guy. Let's make a new job though. Let's just call it rot, or let's just call it YouTube, just so we know that it's very different from the one I showed you in the beginning. And I like this guy. Let's do this guy. Let's open him up. Let's hit create. It was created successfully. That's a good sign. Let's just take a look. Let's edit it. Oh, looks all good. I can see the image. That was one of the things we did early on. Go back, and now let's run inference, and fingers crossed everything's going to work. Boom! ID2 classified as black rot. How crazy is that? This is awesome. Let's go back. Let's try a new one. I want to do, let's do scab. I think this model that I trained is not super great, but let's give it a shot. Yeah, that's pretty decent. Let's go ahead and create that. Go back, make sure that it's the right one. Perfect. Now let's just run inference. Let's just see what we got. I actually haven't ran this in a while. Look at that. ID 3 identified as scab. How crazy is that? So with that, you have a fully functioning Ruby on Rails web application that you can now go deploy to Heroku, Google Cloud, anything that is publicly accessible, and let the users play with your TensorFlow model. As long as that system can support TensorFlow, you're in business. This should be awesome. There's a little bit of nuance with installing Rails on some of those things, specifically with Google Cloud. I've had a few issues. Nothing too crazy. Maybe I'll make a new video on that. But if there's anything you guys would like to see, let me know. I'll try to make new videos as quickly as possible. I'm starting to do more with the machine learning tutorials. I've got a lot kind of queued up that I'm planning on doing, so look for those. Otherwise, just hit that like button and subscribe. Thank you so much. Have a great day.